Okay, so in Revit, from the home screen, we are making a new file. We do not want Imperial Construction. We want Imperial Architecture and OK. Again, the quick reminder in Revit, right over here is my project browser. We are doing line work, so we really don't need anything other than our floor plan levels. So even though we're going to be drawing some elevations, drawing those on your floor plan for this project is going to be just fine. Okay? It's an easier way to think about it for right now. My wheel is going to zoom in and out. Holding the wheel down is going to pan. And most of the commands I'm going to be activating or starting by the left mouse button. Okay? So on this project, we are going to be going looking at line drawing with the annotate detail lines. There are two line types inside of Revit, though, to be aware of. There are model lines, and there are annotation detail lines. Model lines exist as part of your 3D model. Okay, so super important to know the difference. Until you're sort of Revit Pro level, you're typically not going to be using the model lines very often. Okay, so let's take a look at the difference, though, really quick. The tool palette, the drawing method are almost identical. The model lines are going to default to a green line. So just draw something out. The annotation line, annotate, detail lines are going to default to a thin line, which is going to show up as black. So right away, I'm going to use the spline tool just so you can also see sort of another difference in terms of the two lines. So this annotation line that I drew as a spline is only going to exist in my level 1 view. It is sort of an overlay line. If I go to my default 3D view, you won't see this spline, but you will see these. Model lines are part of my three-dimensional model. They are part of the three-dimensional world. Okay? So going to the three-dimensional world, I'll see that, not the spline. The annotation detail lines are only to add those little bit of additional detail into your 3D model to compensate for what we don't model, right? So if I go back to level 1, I can see that spline. Now there are a lot of instances in Revit where I need those tools. So let's hover over it and you'll get a really good example right out of the gate. And that is something like adding detail to a foundation wall or a wall section. Right? We're not going to 3D model the squiggly line that represents insulation inside of a wall everywhere, right? But we can add that in really quickly in my section using the detail line tools. Same thing with, some simple, like there's a nut and bolt and the stud at the base. All of those kind of things are often best done with the detail line tools, okay? The other thing about detail line tools are if I cut a section as a floor plan. So again, in Revit, everything's a section. So if I have a window that's above that 4-foot mark on my floor plan, I'll want to use my detail line tool to go in and draw that window in, even though it's not going to show up as part of my default floor plan inside of Revit if that window is happening up higher. Because I would rather my client know that that window is there in the floor plan, and I'd rather my general contractor know that it's there and not have to reference both the floor plan and the elevation to get their total on windows. Right? So Revit is going to draw technically correct. Right? It's above my 4-foot cut plane. I'm not drawing that window. But as a designer, I often need to communicate that. And that's the other thing where those detail lines come in super, super important. And then there's some other things too, like drawing in lines for sidewalks, stuff like that, or the last minute stuff to make the drawing pop just a little bit more. I'll often be going in with detail lines and adding in those last few little elements to make sure that the drawing is communicating well with the detail line tool, rather than trying to model in 3D all of those things out. Okay, so I'm going to take a second and delete. I'm going to left click to select, hit the delete button. I can also lasso. So super important to know the difference. If I right lasso, it selects only the things that are inside of the lasso. If I left lasso, it's going to select everything the lasso touches or is inside of the lasso. Let's get rid of all that stuff. And let's go back to detail lines. So there are a series of line types to draw with. I'm going to start with a wide line. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit and draw a wide line, a medium line, and a thin line. So you can think of those as your tech pens from your studio kit. You can add more line weights in as you need them, but I have found typically when I'm doing drawings, especially for architecture, thick, medium, thin, that's really enough. If I need like an uber thick line, a lot of times I just copy the thick line a couple times to make it look a little better. Easy peasy. Other line types. So Revit is also not going to draw in something that is overhead, like a balcony or a roof overhang or something like that. So there's a line type for that, overhead. So that gives me a standard dash line. And there's also things like demo or center line. Like if I've got a symmetry issue or I've got a line of columns or a column grid, something like that, I'm going to use that center line as a way to put those in place. Okay, these are scale dependent in terms of their size. Okay, so if I decrease my scale, those lines are going to change their thickness relative to my view on screen. They are not going to change their thickness relative to how they print out. Right? So if I change this to 1 equals 200, what's that going to do to the thickness of the lines on screen? Thicker or thinner? That's an early morning brain work question. 1 vote for thinner. Do I have a vote for thicker? Okay, 1 to 200. Right? Scale got smaller. Lines had to get wider because they are going to print at a standard width. That wide line knows it's supposed to be a certain width. It's easier to see that with text. So let me put in some text here really quick. So it's also under Annotate, Text. So this is 1/4 inch Arial. So no matter what scale I'm at, it's always going to print the text at a 1/4 inch in height. So if I do this and type in words, I think I misspelled words. W-O-R-D-S, enter. I have the word words, right? But it's huge because my scale is small. If I change that from 1 to 200 back to 1/8, I'm back to this. Right? So Revit's always going to be doing that. So be aware of how that's going to happen. That is by design. If there's a little button right here, on occasion we need to remove line weights while we're drawing. So let's say not 1/8, but let's say that I'm working at 1 to 40 and things get a little bit crazy with my line weights. And that's not too bad. Let's do 1. There we go. Like I really need to find the edge of one of these lines, and it's a little bit hard because it's chunky on the edges. I can hit this little button right here, thin lines, and that takes everything back to its vector. That's defining the line. Okay? So that's a great little shortcut to have right there if something is a little bit tricky to read. So let's put that back to 1/8 inch. Slide words over. Okay, so as I'm drawing, if you notice in this detail line, we are wanting to build lines specifically to drive the laser cutter. Okay? And that is going to be a unique line type. In other words, we don't want the laser finding everything that I do to represent a wall, a sidewalk, a window, insulation, etc. We want it to find a very specific line that we tag as laser. And that doesn't exist in this list. So we need to build one. To do that, I'm going to go to Manage, Additional Settings, and Line Styles. Manage, additional setting, line styles. And when I activate line styles, I get this dialog box. I'm going to expand my categories by hitting the plus sign. And this will give me all the line types in the project. So this is both model lines and detail lines that you're seeing. And I am going to go new category. And I'm going to name it laser and hit enter. And that adds laser into my list. I'm going to make it a color different from everything else in my set as well, because the laser is going to look for a specific set of colors, and then that is going to control what gets cut and what doesn't. So in other words, if I chose black as the color for the laser to look for, it would pick up not only every wall, every line that you've already modeled, but also your title blocks and everything else. It would try and cut everything. So we want to make a very different color. And our standard here at HSA is that green. Not any other green, not a greenish green, but R0, green 255, blue 0. That green. The laser can also find red, or it can find black too, but don't. Red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and magenta. It will work with all of those colors. But typically, if somebody's working in the I/O and they're trying to help you get something sent to the laser cutter, they are going to be looking for those green lines as your default starting point. Now, you can get to the point where you have 3 or 4 different colors doing different things. Like I can set one laser cut line to be full power, and that's green. It's going to cut through my chipboard. I can set another laser cut line to be 50% power and only engrave on the top of the chipboard. So I can actually use the laser cutter to draw lines as well as cut. And I do that by setting different colors, different powers on the laser. We'll get there on this project, okay? But for right now, we're just going to use green, aggressive 255 green, right? The next line right here, while I was showing you the line weight things, I have 1 to 16. 16 being huge Mongo Sharpie line that you have to hold with 2 hands kind of line, right? 1 being the thinnest line possible. We want to stick with 1 on this. It used to be the laser cutter actually wouldn't pick up anything unless it was set to the thinnest line possible. It's much better at picking up. If it's green, it's going to cut it now, okay? So that's pretty simple. We can hit OK. And now when I go to Annotate, Detail Line, under my line list, you will see laser. And as I draw with that, it is going to be that bright green line. The other nice thing about that bright green line is it shows up really nicely over, like if I have an elevation, if I have a Revit elevation, that green line shows up really nicely as I'm tracing out my elevation to cut that portion of the model. So I can quickly trace windows, doors, etc. in an elevation view. And that green line will hover very nicely over those black lines. It's super easy to see. Cool? So let's talk really quickly about the different ways to draw lines. Well, let's talk first about how to delete lines. I can select a line and hit delete, or I can also use the tab key to select all of my lines that are sort of grouped together in a single chain. I can do that by hovering over the line, and before I left click, I can hit the tab key. And all of those lines that are connected together end to end, it's going to say, oh, you mean all of those. Then I can left click, then I can delete. Okay? So the tab key is all about selection options, which as you're building a complicated 3D model, that tab key becomes super important because maybe I want this specific mullion, not that glass or the wall behind it. So I would use the tab key to cycle through those options that all exist in the same space. So it's super, super important, and it's like really smart. It's like right there by your home keys on your left hand. So if your left hand is on ASDF, the tab key is really easy to get to. If you're a left-handed mouse user, I got nothing for you. Other than I'm sorry. Okay, so let's get into the methods of drawing lines. So I'm still set to an 1/8 inch. Annotate, detail lines. The tools you're going to use the most are the line, the circle, the spline, and trace. Okay, but let's cover them really quick anyway. So the line, notice this little chain box is checked. That means that each left click, it's going to string a line together. If, for some instance, I've accidentally unchecked chain, it gives me an individual series of lines. Less convenient, okay? When I'm done with my line tool, I'm tapping escape once to drop the line tool and a second time to drop the detail line tool. So let me show you how that works again really quick. I'm going to go detail lines. I'm turning chain back on. Left click, left click, left click. I can tap escape once to drop the line, but I can go right back into drawing lines because I haven't dropped the tool altogether. If I'm ready to drop the tool altogether, I double tap escape, 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 and now I'm out of the detail line drawing tool. So those are orthogonal or non-curvilinear or straight lines. I can draw a box. Yay. Two different methods of drawing polygons, and you can define their size. So like if I want a 20-sided polygon, that almost looks like a circle, right? But it's not. You can do all those things. Detail lines, circles. Circles are typically drawn first by establishing the center point, and then the radius is your second click. Really important to note, if I select that circle, you will see what's called a temporary dimension pop up. And in this case, it is 17 feet as the temporary radius. If I want to change that circle, all that I have to do is click on that number 17 and say, I really needed that to be 12. Thank you very much. It will change the size of the circle for you automatically, simply by typing in a new dimension. Okay? And all of these things will do that. If my box is the wrong size, right now it's 76. If I wanted that box to be 80, I've got that line selected. I can select my dimension. I can type in 80, and it's going to push that line over. So that dimension is now 80 feet from this line to this line. So those temporary dimensions are always active in the background. You just have to select something. Sometimes you have to tell it where you want it to go, and then type in your new number. Pretty easy. And it's this sort of mode of working that you can kind of push things around in Revit to their exact location. Let's keep working through my different line types. Arcs. You do your endpoints and then establish your arc. And then, as mentioned, like 31.5 and 33.256 is ridiculous. So, like a lot of times you want to go back in and just make those an actual dimension. A few different methods for drawing arcs, but then this one is particularly handy. This is the fillet arc. So if with that activated, I can select two things that are converging, and then I can select my arc that I want, and it will put them together as an arc. Okay. The spline, that's what I was playing around with earlier. So it lets you set a series of points, and Revit is going to smooth out the path from beginning to end. Again, with that selected, I can come back in and kind of work those points to a slightly different location and continue to tweak to get the exact curve that I'm looking for. Detail lines. Then I've got ellipses, which are nice. And then I've got a trace. It's called pick lines. It's best to think of it as tracing. Okay, so let's say really quick that I have a wall. And that wall has a series of windows in it. Let's look at that in its north elevation. If I needed this to go to the laser quickly, right, I would go to Annotate, Detail Line. I want to make sure my laser is selected. Then I can go Pick Lines, Edge of Wall, Edge of Wall, Edge of Wall, Edge of Wall, Window, 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 and Window, 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 and you guys kind of get the idea. From there, I can select one detail line. I can isolate the category. So now everything's going to be hidden except for my lines. And I'm ready to send that to the laser cutter. So pick lines, that idea of tracing something, super, super fast. Cool. Let's go back to my level 1 plan. Detail lines. Okay, so we covered all of that. And let's look at modifying those lines. So I'm going to get rid of, let's keep that around. Let's get rid of this stuff right there. And get rid of that. Okay. I can manipulate these lines as well. So the easy manipulations are found underneath modify. And the key ones that we're going to show today are offset and split, or offset, trim, and split. Okay, so offset allows me to push something one direction or another. So let's say that these group of lines, that was the beginning of a floor plan. And for some reason or another, I didn't want to use walls. I just wanted to draw it out with lines. So let's say that my walls were 1 foot thick. So I've got offset activated. I'm going to offset, and you can think of offset as copy, but it's sort of an automated version of copy. I'm going to offset by 1 foot. I can do all of those to the inside. So I'm hovering with my mouse, and whichever side my mouse is to, or the cursor is to, it's going to offset the line in that direction. So I can go offset, 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 and offset. Now, it didn't do that perfectly. I sort of have this edge right here. We don't like it when you draw walls like that in Studio, right? You need to trim that up. Also, if I'm using that as a laser cutter, it's going to cut right through that. I'm not going to get pieces. I'm going to get a dissection of things. That's where trim comes in. So trim gets rid of those little extra pieces, or it extends your extra pieces. Okay, so for instance, let's take this guy right here. I'm going to extend this down. So the trim works entirely by clicking on the parts that you want to keep. Okay, so in this case, I want to keep the inside edge of this line. So I'm going to go trim, left click to trim those lines together. Undo. If I wanted that to the outside, I would need to left click here to the outside to keep those lines. Left click. So it's going to keep what you click on. Right? So the key with the trim, click what you want to keep. Click, click. Next, if I have a break someplace, like let's say that I had a window somewhere in here, I would go Annotate, Detail Lines, and let's say that I had a window opening right here. If I trim this out, so I'm going to go to Modify, Trim, here to here, and then here to here. It got rid of all those lines for me, right? Not good. I needed those lines. Now I have to draw them again, and I don't want to do that. Again, it's not a big deal if you have to do it once or twice, but if you have to do that 400 times throughout the course of the day, you've just lost an hour of sleep. I don't wish that upon you. Okay, so let's undo. This is where split comes in. Split will take that one line and make it 2 lines, right? So now I have 2 line segments. So when I come into trim, 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 trimity, trim, trim, trim. Cool. Now I have an opening. So we did modify, trim, split. Yeah, you now know AutoCAD. Not quite, but pretty darned close. AutoCAD is primarily based on 2-dimensional line drawing. The key difference between AutoCAD and Revit in terms of how the line drawing tools work is AutoCAD is going to put all of those lines in a specific layering system. And almost every office does their layering systems their own way. But you can now, like learning this after this assignment and getting comfortable drawing lines, you can walk into any office and pick up AutoCAD and be pretty efficient pretty quickly, depending on how they have AutoCAD set up. Because that's pretty much what AutoCAD does. That said, most offices are fully switched over to them. There's not very many AutoCAD offices left out there. Okay. Yeah, that's it for today, you guys. Woohoo!